We intend to expand intermodal facilities in Alliance, Texas, Seattle, Los Angeles, Memphis, and Chicago. Other planned infrastructure improvements including sidings in South Dakota and Oklahoma and fueling and mechanical facilities in Illinois and Texas. On the Transcon between Chicago and LA, the addition of the second and third track, as well as improvement of places like Needles and Berlin, will not only benefit intermodal, but will also benefit many other customers such as ethanol, grain, as well as our industrial business. Even on corridors such as our coal business that are viewed primarily for our coal business, we know that the expansion capacity that's going in there will have a positive impact for other businesses that route through there. While clearly more rail capacity is needed, at BNSF we believe that the regulatory model is working as intended. This slide points out the direct relationship between our return on invested capital and the ability to reinvest in our business and invest for expansion capacity. Higher returns have allowed us to make the investments required to improve velocity and efficiency and to handle increased demand from our customers and, quite frankly, the nation. We must be able to sustain the returns to reinvest at the right levels within our network. As long as volume is forecasted to grow and we can receive proper value for the transportation services, we will invest in capital at levels to handle future growth in our economy. A return to rate and service regulation will only stifle our ability to invest in capacity expansion. In summary, as you will hear all day long, railroads certainly play an essential role in the commerce of our nation, and we have to play an even larger role in the future. If we're to successfully handle growth in the transportation sector while demand is increasing, while other issues such as highway congestion and passenger mobility are getting worse, through our regulatory structure and policies, we need to support the addition of capacity to our national rail network. We need to treat the national rail network as a national system. Piecemeal regulation of the railroads at the state and local level will reduce our ability to make the fullest use of existing and future capacity. We need security mandates that strike a proper balance between security and the free flow of commerce. We need to address environmental laws and regulations that make it difficult to add rail capacity to the rail network. It's ironic that these same laws and regulations intended to protect the environment result in delaying the additional rail capacity. Additional rail capacity means more efficient land use, reduced fuel consumption, and improved air quality compared with the highway alternative. We need to implement more public-private partnerships that will provide public benefits. Finally, we need to encourage investment in the freight rail infrastructure. We need to supplement the current model with a stimulus. Not enough to make a bad investment occur, but enough to pull good investments forward sooner in the cycle. The investment tax credit, Senate Bill 3742, is an example of public policy that will stimulate continued investments for rail capacity, not only by our industry, but by shippers who use rail as well. It's really very simple. The railroad model works like all other industries. The healthier the industry, the more money it will put into investment. Lower returns will cause lower capital spending and further rationing of the physical plant. Earlier today, you heard the Secretary talk about grading, or I think it was Commissioner Buttrey asked about the grading of the railroad industry. The railroad industry is not a C-. My railroad, I do not accept that. And I've been across enough of the other national railroad parts of the national industry. It is not a C-. Our national railroad network is in excellent condition today. Last week, I went across Stampede Pass. This is a great example of how railroads will grow. 10 years ago, we rehabilitated that line, put $140 million into it to allow us to have a third route to the Pacific Northwest. Without sustainable returns, that route would have eventually been a bike path. BNSF's expanded its locomotive and freight car fleets. The new equipment that we're now bringing on will not only allow us to handle more freight, but also the locomotives are much more fuel efficient and environmentally friendly than the older equipment. We've been able to invest in this capacity required to meet the growth for the demand of our customers and our nation's economy. We want to be able to continue that investment and expand it even further. You will hear from others interested in rail capacity today. I would ask you to ask them one simple question. Will the proposal that you are advocating result in more rail capacity or less? Thank you for your time. I appreciate this opportunity to present.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Mr. Young?
Good morning. I think BN may owe me a couple minutes here, but we'll see how we do here. I flew in last night from North Platte, Nebraska. I'm in the middle of a field visit this week that we'll be spending 5 days visiting employees, customers, local community officials. There's one common thing that comes out in every meeting, and it's the question of capacity expansion. And not so much one of are we putting investment in, but are we putting it in fast enough? I can tell you that message is consistent. You're going to hear that today from every railroad. I believe you need to be out in the field to understand really what the mood is on the ground. I commend you, Mr. Chairman. I know you're going to be out on the BNSF and UP in a few weeks on a railroad trip. I'm going to introduce you to some of those customers that I'm talking with today, and I think you'll see their real concerns. I'm going to take a few minutes here to walk through our approach in capital infrastructure at Union Pacific. And one of the things you're going to hear from all the railroads today, it's not all about iron in the ground, as we call it, capital. In fact, this industry is bankrupt if the only answer is putting capacity in the ground. Deregulating our industry several years ago forced us to become more efficient. We have a process internally that we start before we put capital in, ask ourselves, what can we do to get more out of the asset today? Asset utilization in this industry, while it has improved, is still a significant challenge. We look at process initiatives. I'll give you an example. We sent folks that work out in North Platte, they service locomotives. We sent a team to NASCAR school. It's really an efficiency view where you take a look at how do you service a locomotive, turn that asset quickly and safely. The results of that process change. We reduce the servicing time 50% on a $2 million asset. Organizational initiatives are things we look at. You hear a lot of this today from customers. How well are our marketing teams, operating teams working with customers to incent asset turns? What's an example? Unloading more than 5 days a week. Working to move an asset that shows up on a Friday afternoon, get it unloaded and get it turned. Those are ways of generating assets and returns without putting capital in the ground. Technology is a third initiative. Matt mentioned train control, computer-aided dispatch. Those are all major investments that we're looking at that will generate improved asset utilization. I'll give you a simple one, though. Out in North Platte yesterday, visited our RIP track. This is where empty coal trains are coming in before they head up into the coal mines. It's an area where technology identifies you've got a wheel defect. That wheel needs to be changed out of that car. Historically, it was, in some cases, 1 to 2 days to fix that process. Switch the car out of the train, the asset sits, change the wheel, get it back in a train. Our employees took the initiative. They found some very simple technology in Europe. That technology today, they now did, in fact, yesterday they showed me an example. They changed that wheel in 7 minutes. And you think about that a minute. What I like best about it is that was something that came out from our employees, their initiatives. The final step is iron in the ground. Now let's talk about a few of the other things here. The network initiative, you hear a lot about in my business. We talk about the unified plan. I just had a 46-year railroader retire here a year ago, Dick Davidson. And one of the things he said is he was walking out of the door, this is a much, much different business than when in his career. How you operate a network when it's capacity constraints really requires a lot of innovative thinking. Network simplification is one of the things we focus on. More point-to-point trains. When you think about turning assets, that's what you get out of point-to-point trains. Workload reduction in terms of how we simplify the approach in our business. Balancing equipment flows is a big deal in terms of thinking, look at assets. Interline management, 30% of the business at Union Pacific we hand off to our partners in the CSX and Norfolk Southern. Lean, that's code for industrial engineering. We've modeled what UPS does in terms of people on the ground that look at how to get most out of the process. SIMS is a technology solution that was put in place about 2 years ago. Very simple tool, but what it does, it gives you much more visibility in terms of flows on the network and allows you to manage, working with customers, how we turn assets more efficiently. You step back and look at where UP has spent money over the last 6-7 years. This chart really illustrates the point that there is no other industry in the world that puts their money back into the business. You look at the blue bar there shows our operating costs. You show what we pay on interest. You show what we've done in net debt reduction over the years. And you also see capital investments. Point of this chart, a small portion of the cash that comes into this business actually goes back to shareholders in terms of dividends. If you look at our capital spend at Union Pacific this year, $3.2 billion, all-time record for this industry. We're making a bet today because we're talking about making investments in assets that have lives of 20, 30, 40 years. We're making a bet that we can continue to improve our returns. We are not earning our cost of capital today. Some logic would say, why don't you wait, raise prices even more, get capacity tighter, and then make the investment. I'm confident that we can continue to improve those returns. We're investing for the future here. The map shows our choke points. You've heard us talk about the Sunset Corridor. Should have been double-tracked years ago. I can't look backwards. I have to look forwards. Our plan right now is we're going to accelerate double-tracking that corridor from an 8-year timeline to 4 years. If you look at the pie, it shows you where we spend our money. One of the things you'll note there, $1.5 billion goes into maintenance of the way. A well-maintained railroad is a railroad that you generate velocity, it improves safety, and it generates assets. What's interesting in the $3.2 billion, about $2 billion are required every year simply to keep the doors open. I would call that maintenance. You've got maintenance in the ground, a maintenance way, but also replacing locomotives or freight cars that have their economic lives are over. If you look at the timeline here in terms of Union Pacific's capital spend, now keep in mind $2 billion is maintenance. Anything above that is growth. You can see our spend pattern here. It's only been recently that we've started to put, in my mind, some real growth capacity into the business here. Again, part of that is a function of our ability here to start to improve our returns and confidence that we see going forward here that we can continue to improve those returns. Now, when you think of the future here, the question is obviously what's out in front of us here. This is a map we have when we do a 5-year plan looking at our capacity needs. We've got substantial challenges in terms of when we think about growth, in terms of putting capacity into the railroad. Sunset Corridor's in there. Again, LA to El Paso, you look at coming out of the Powder River Basin, both BN and UP have substantial investments we're making in that joint line, but also delivering ethanol, ag products coming out of Iowa, moving into Arizona, coal moving to the east, intermodal. We have a fairly major challenge here. There's one other item, though, that this industry, I believe, is ahead of us that we're going to have to deal with. You might call it a day of reckoning in terms of some things we have to deal with. Bridge infrastructures, tunnels, and facilities are a major investment requirement that this industry faces going forward here. I'll give you an example here, and I know Commissioner Mulvey, we've talked before about replacement value and book values and how you think about returns, but here's some real-world examples that many people don't see. When you have assets that are 20, 30, 40, 50 years, in some cases 100-year lives, the replacement value obviously is significantly higher than what it is in the books. Here's some examples here. 2005, we basically had our Caliente Canyon, had a 100-year flood, wiped out a major piece of the line. We rebuilt that railroad, cost me $87 million. The book value was $4 million. Kansas Bridge, 2005, put a bridge in the creek down there, $6 million, book value $54,000. Here's a recent one. Unfortunately, I'm replacing bridges through fires, not on a more of a program approach, but we had a major bridge fire out in California, 60 trains a day, 6 commuter trains a day, $14 million to replace that bridge. It was built in 1910. Net book value is $0. It basically had run its economic life. So one of the challenges when we think about returns and incentives is how do we think about it in the context of replacement value of assets going forward. Matt had a chart. Here's a similar chart. You're probably going to hear this from every one of the CEOs in terms of this is an industry chart that shows capital investment and returns. We can debate the methodology on cost of capital, on return on investment. The real question in my mind is where's that point that really incents true economic expansion? If you look at it, there's no question that higher returns generate more investment in our business here. This next chart shows you, well, you read a lot about the health of our industry in terms of financial performance. These are the guys that can do the most damage. These are the credit agencies that rate your bonds. And at the end of the day, this is an industry that is one notch above junk bond status. If you compare us, in fact, you'll see we're right in the middle of the pack of when you look at S&P 500 on the health of our industry going forward. Why is it that way? It's a simple fact. The credit agencies look at the capital needs and the consumption in our industry. There's no other industry in the world that has the kind of capacity and capital needs that we have. You look at, here's another example in my mind of what's staring us in the face going forward. This is the bridge at Clinton, Iowa over the Mississippi River, built in the early 1900s, about 60 trains a day. It has been on our radar screen for about 3 years for replacement. It's a $100 to $150 million investment. Right now, it's very difficult to justify this investment. When you think about incentives like investment tax credits, it would help in this area. This is a major choke point in our system. I think the ITC would help get us over that hill in terms of looking at the return on the investment and justify expanding this investment here. Matt had mentioned we're all dealing with this, every railroad in terms of local communities today. We no longer can take an approach that we're the railroad, we're going to do it our way. We have to take an approach that says we've got to work in the local communities. 2 weeks ago, we submitted a proposal to the ports of LA, ports of Long Beach for an expansion at our intermodal container facility. It's a $300 million investment. It would be the most environmentally friendly intermodal facility in the world. It is a high-cost proposition for us. Right now, I give us a 50-50 chance of getting this improved. But whether you're talking about California, San Antonio, Houston, Chicago, the cost for an expansion in these communities is going up exponentially. Again, something we need to think about when we look at return on invested capital. So to summarize with this, no question in terms of capacity needs in the railroad industry, competitiveness of the U.S. economy. We've benefited from a really excess capacity supply over the years. You think about safety, environmental advantages. Rail, it really is the answer. We're 2 to 3 times more fuel efficient. Our emissions compared to moving business on the highway are substantially improved. We know our higher returns investment are encouraging us to invest more in capacity. Again, I have made the bet that we've kicked our capital up and we can continue to improve our returns going forward. We are at record levels. At the end of the day here, I think the question of this commission is one on how do you incent motivation, innovation, and growth in our business here. There's a very fine line in my mind when you look at the returns in this business, which is the difference between Union Pacific investing $3.2 billion today or $2.5 billion tomorrow. The margin for error is pretty thin in terms of those kind of economic parameters. So I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Young. We'll now proceed with questions, and we'll just, I think, offer questions to both of you and maybe certain ones to one or each of you, but feel free to jump in. I've got a couple I'll start off with. Mr. Rose, we've heard today about record railroad investment in infrastructure and capacity, yet we'll hear a little later, of course, as you won't be surprised, about a lot of shipper unhappiness out there. How do you reconcile those two realities? You're doing more than you ever have in the past, trying to presumably meet your customers' needs, meet the nation's needs, yet you've got a lot of unhappy customers. Why is that?
I think it's a great question. It's a fair question. I think you have to put it in context. First, for the people who have been around since the Staggers Act, since the change of the railroad industry, they're dealing with a different environment. Our cost of our supply chain in this country a couple years ago started going up for the first time in decades. And quite frankly, people are seeing increases in trucking costs. They're seeing increases in rail costs for the first time in literally 20 to 22 years. And so they're seeing a whole different environment that quite frankly is very frustrating. And then on top of that, certain customers are starting to question, will they even have access to the rail industry? And that is something I think when they think about getting their goods to market is really at the root of their concerns. You know, you've got other people that are brand new to the rail industry who, quite frankly, weren't around in the 80s to see what the infrastructure looked like. I mean, it's amazing, Chairman, just dealing with the politicians, how many people don't even understand the state of the railroad industry in the late 70s and the early 80s. I mean, it was in bankruptcy chaos. The country at that time had a couple different ways to go, and it chose to free it of regulation and allow the natural market to sort this all out. And it's taken 2.5 decades to finally find that equilibrium of demand and capacity. And with that, there's a tension that rates generally in tight capacity markets will go up, and there's been this frustration. So I think it's something that is a viable concern, and it is because there's a lot of pressure out there on these supply chains as far as costs going up. But again, what I think that we need to have sessions like this and to have the dialogue. Every time I hear people say, well, we want to legislate to change this or legislate to change that, the litmus test always has to be, will your change increase more capacity? We've proposed a change, investment tax credit. Will that increase more rail capacity? I can assure you it will on our railroad.
Mr. Young?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I have not met a customer yet that would thank me for a price increase, and I'm in front of them often in terms of we take it very serious and understand the implications on the competitive position of that customer and what it means internally. But I'll also tell you, I think what's happening out here, and I'll give you a good example. Sitting across the table from one of my customers, very angry, and I really couldn't put the handle on it, and he looked across the table from me and he said, Jim, let me tell you that every year I could count on Union Pacific to cut rates. And at the end of the day, that was what was most important in terms of that particular individual's view of the transportation product that was provided. We, though, always end the conversation on what are we doing about capacity and expansion. My commitment to our customers is, as I get my returns up, which are absolutely necessary, they're going to see more capital investment. We specifically identified for the customers, and they're going to continue to see good service. Our customer satisfaction surveys right now are the best they've been in about 8 years. So I think there's a mindset we're dealing with here and a concern. I think it's a valid concern about how far and how fast. But when you consider the capacity needs and the efficiency that railroads bring, I think we're moving in the right direction.
Thanks. I'd like to ask each of you to reflect forward about 5 years out and talk to me a little bit about where you see rail capacity and infrastructure 5 years from now, and related to that, what you believe the appropriate regulatory model should be to support a sustainable rail network. Mr. Rose?
You know, I think as far as the capacity, a lot of it's going to depend on the highway, and I agree with the Secretary that given where the country is in terms of the needs of social programs, the idea of having another Eisenhower-type build-out of the national highway system is probably questionable. And while you'll see some innovative programs come into that side in terms of privatization and tolling and congestion-based issues, generally I don't think that the highway system will keep up in terms of expansion, keep up with commerce. And so I do believe that the rail system is going to be expected. And the great news here is that the rail system can expand as long as we keep proper regulatory oversight in terms of environmental and things like that. The rail environment can expand to be able for, like the BNSF case, to be able to grow another 3.5 million units or 5 million units and increase our share to aid our customers and our trucking companies, as well as delivering the nation's coal and all those things. As far as the regulatory structure, I think it's a little ironic that coming into staggers, one of the tenets, of course, of staggers was the issue of pricing to incent more business at a variable cost to come onto the network, differential pricing as we refer to it. What we're actually seeing within our own models is that with various capacity and demand changes that I believe in 5 years you'll see the non-regulated business on the railroad networks generally provide sustainable or in excess of some of the regulated commodities. And I think that that's something that you and Congress and whoever is going to decide to play in this game is going to have to consider, because if you have a part, if you get to a point in time where the exempt traffic is being supported by the non-exempt traffic and giving you those false economics, I think it's going to be really dangerous to future rail investment. So, what will the future rail regulatory investment be? I hope that it stays within the current guidelines of making sure that more investments are supported by a regulatory policy that we have today.
Mr. Young, take a crack at that.
Sure. I think the number one issue we're facing right now is certainty of the future. When you think about lead times in terms of making investments today, it's not unusual. You look at an investment, it's a 2 or 3 year lead time. When you think about supply chain, the environmental permits, you're in fact making a bet. My biggest concern is that the certainty of this model from a regulatory perspective is going to get much grayer. If we see that continue to move in the wrong direction, Union Pacific, we would have to step back and really question whether it's prudent to spend the kind of capital we're doing today. Again, because you're putting investments in the ground that are 30, 40, 50-year kinds of investments out here. So we need certainty in terms of where we're going here. I won't repeat what Matt said, but we're seeing a similar issue that the regulated versus deregulated kind of commodities, they're converging here. And part of it is efficiency in the supply chain. One of the things we have to think about long term, again, are the efficiencies. Customers vary. Customers make investments in terms of ensuring, and I have customers that approach and say they want to be viewed as the most productive customer partners that we have. They're willing to make investments in very efficient load-unload capabilities. They're willing to work 7 days a week in terms of turning assets. I hope this trend we see today in investment moving forward will continue. But again, I think certainty in terms of regulation is what we need.
Mr. Young, if I could just come back to you with a question, and I'll ask the same of Mr. Rose. And I very much appreciated the charts that you presented on showing your capital spending and breaking that down into categories. I think it's awfully important for us, all of us, to understand better is what capital spending is, how it's broken down. If I follow the pie chart correctly, you're spending about $550 million on what you call capacity investments out of a $3.2 billion total capital spending budget. And I realize there's not a whole lot in common between my past experience running a large state highway department. But if I do my math correctly, you're at somewhere between 15 and 20% of your capacity, your capital spending is focused on capacity investments. And if I went to my state legislature back in Virginia and said, got good news, I'm spending more than ever on capacity, it's up to 15, 17% of our budget, I would have been charged out of town. But it's a different business, obviously. I don't want to compare unfairly, but I know it's more than recent years or perhaps ever. Yeah, but tell me, is it enough? Is 15, 16, 17% of your capital spending enough on capacity, given the data we've already heard about from DOT and we'll hear more about today?
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities on the highway side when you think about capacity going forward here. This is a new territory for us, $3.2 billion. You look at just the ability to get the work done. You can do the math. The AASHTO report that's is out says that at the rate of spending we're seeing today, it likely will not be enough going forward. And again, I think the question is, well, we've had 2 or 3 years of improving financial health in our industry, increased capital spending. I think, again, would look at the replacement costs and the assets. That is where my biggest concern is. $2.5 million a mile to put a new railroad in will be a challenge. So I think while we were making a good crack at it this year, it wouldn't surprise you that the request and the list of projects that are on the table far exceed $3.2 billion.
Mr. Rose, you care to answer the
question? I agree with Jim. I think that it's probably not enough, and it depends a lot on what the economy is going to do. But if you assume 3 to 3.5% type GDP growth and more trucking capacity wanting to utilize the railroad system without some major change in the highway system, which I don't I think it'll be a stretch to have anywhere within a 10-year view. It may not be enough. And again, I think then, Chairman, you have to say, well, you just got to do more. Well, that's what we're trying to offer solutions in terms of like things like the investment tax credit. It's hard for us running companies that are owned by shareholders to go and say, well, we want to move our capital as a percent of revenue from 18, 19, 20% to 25 to 27% when we're just now hitting what I think by any stretch of the imagination it would be acceptable returns. And that's really seems to be at the root of this issue of, are these egregious profits? Is a 10% or 11% return egregious? And again, from a lot of the testimony you're going to hear from customers today, they would never accept within their own company a 10% return and make the type of investments that we're making. And so I think certainty around the investment, but I think in direct answer to your question, it may not be enough.
Thank you. Let's turn to Vice Chairman Buttry now for any questions he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're hearing and reading a lot these days about ethanol, where it's headed, how much it's going to be produced, where it's going to be produced, how's it going to get from where it's produced to where it's going to be used. And if you read and believe, if you believe what you're reading about how much ethanol there is going to be out there, and if the tariffs on foreign-produced ethanol stay where they are now, there's going to be very little or no ethanol coming in from offshore. And if the incentives stay in place as they are now, people are betting that there's going to be an awful lot of ethanol produced. And for that reason, I see a lot of ethanol just sitting somewhere waiting to be moved. You said earlier, I think, Mr. Rose, that you thought you would be able to meet the demand for ethanol movement on your railroad, and I didn't hear anything about it from Mr. Young, but I don't know whether he views that the same way or not. But I'd like to hear from both of you on that issue. But we're also reading that there's nowhere near enough tank cars in existence are going to be produced anytime soon to move all this ethanol. What's that all about? Where do you see that headed, and what is your planning in place to try to meet that demand, and how do you view that?
Well, I think this is a great example where, 5 years ago the country couldn't spell ethanol, then all of a sudden the country wants to drape itself in ethanol, and the first thing that everybody wants to do is blame the railroad somehow. I mean, we were getting blamed for ethanol failures before anybody even called us and asked us if we'd like to put a rail spur into an ethanol plant. So we've had a real disconnect initially with these ethanol facilities. That has gotten much better. The reality, the facts today, last year we moved 35,000 ethanol movements. We increased our ag business by more than double that of what we moved in the entire ethanol segment. So ethanol right now is a rounding error. Ethanol is going to grow, especially if you subscribe to 15 billion gallons or 20 billion gallons, Vice Chairman, as you're saying. As far as rail cars, right now about 40% of all rail cars being built in the United States are ethanol rail cars. Right now, there's no place for them to go. They are literally getting spit out of these manufacturing facilities without a home, and they're going into storage. And that will take place over the next 12 months, and those plants will start to come online. The rails to go into those plants will start to come online, and then the cars will start to feed that. So as far as whether or not the rail car guys will have enough plant manufacturing, I can't answer that. But as far as knowing everything that we have on our railroad planned for the next 5 years with ethanol capacity, we're very confident we'll be able to handle that demand.
And all those rail cars will be privately owned. They will not be.
They will all be private. That's exactly right.
Mr. Young.
I think it's a good example where you have to ask the question on where do we peg demand? Should we resource in terms of infrastructure, facilities for the potential peak? I was with one of our large grain customers down in Kansas City here Monday night. He said to me he gets one request a day for a new ethanol facility project out here. As you know, in Union Pacific, one of the things we've done is try to work through, step back, and work strategically with where are the best locations, what's the best design. Plants being designed today are significantly more efficient than the plants that were designed 5 years ago. You're going to see a fallout at some point in terms of the efficiency curve. But the real question is, ethanol competes with coal. It competes with grain, competes with intermodal. When we sit down and look, you can have forecasts that show substantial growth. What we're trying to do here is to ensure that our capacity investment has the right balance across all of our customers. There's some speculation on how long the demand will be there. I think our approach here at UP, I don't see it as an issue today. We have caught up in terms of any kind of backlog. Part of that was the facilities. But again, we have to make some trade-offs in terms of how do you balance this with all the demand on the rail network today.
Thank you. The issue of the ITC is sort of top of the mind awareness for everybody, I think, and where that's likely to end up in the Congress. There's been quite a bit of discussion about whether that ITC should be extended to customers, your customers, to be able to take advantage of the ITC, as would you be able to take advantage of the ITC. What is your position on whether customers would be able to have it available for the customers as well?
The industry position is that all rail investments, whether it's made by a railroad or a customer, in terms of things that will increase capacity, such as storage capacity, or, quite frankly, building a line out to another railroad, would be available to that customer under the ITC.
I think it also fits in the context when you think about this is a new world in terms of railroading, with the total logistics chain from customer origination plant over the road to the destination facility needs to be as efficient as it can. If it's available for a customer to redesign their track configuration yard to improve productivity, it absolutely should be there.
Thank you.
Commissioner Mulvey?
Thank you. I'd like to start out by thanking Matt for his service to the country and working on this commission on transportation policy. It's been a long time since we've had one. It was back in 1979, I believe, was the last major one, and that commission had 10 times your budget in real terms, and a lot more staff, and a lot more time to develop its recommendations. I wanted to ask you, though, do you think that this commission needs to be extended, or do you think you're going to be able to have recommendations that are going to hopefully, unlike previous commissions, see the light of day and result in some actions? And will they be addressing to a significant extent the rail capacity question?
We've already asked for a 6-month extension, and I believe we'll get that. I think clearly this commission is going to come up with some new ideas, some big ideas, and certainly there will be a freight rail component in it. Whether or not anybody adopts any of the recommendations, Commissioner, I have no idea. But it's going to be it's a well thought out report. We're covering literally all the issues that I think need to be covered, and there's a lot of people that have been brought in to bring a lot of ideas to this question.
Recently, there was an announcement that 8 of 11 coal plants, coal-fired power plants in Texas, were not going to be built now. And had you made investments in capacity with the expectation that these plants would come online, you might be facing now all this capacity that will sit in the ground for a long time and not be utilized. Does this decision on these 8 plants give you pause of concern?
What we do at BNSF in regard to coal plants, we don't start any investments till the actual coal plant gets its permit. That still gives us about a 3.5 to 4 year window for their construction period. So while right now we're negotiating, we're debating all the various coal plants around the country, we really will not plan this capacity or start putting anything in the ground until we see the permit actually approved. So in the answer to the Texas question, the answer is no. It won't have any impact on any capacity that's already been put in.
Mr. Young?
Commissioner Mulvey, I think that's another good example of doing a risk assessment. It was about 3 years ago that we were looking for coal business, BN and UP, and that model changed significantly. There was a debate in terms of whether the mines in PRB could survive in terms of the price of coal. That's turned around significantly. I question, though, again, you can look at models and sustainability, but there is a movement today, as you know, in terms of emissions that could have far-reaching consequences on our business here going forward. We're making the bet. BN and UP and the joint line and capacity we're putting in, infrastructure we're putting in our railroad, that demand will be there long term. But I think we have to again, it's assessing your capital risk and making the bet for the future here. Well, I believe coal will be a good growth opportunity for us. There are some potential changes in the environment right now that could diminish that request.
Would you include in that the recently suggested changes in locomotive emission standards as well? Will that also affect your ability to invest?
Well, the question, locomotive availability, again, a new locomotive today is running over $2 million. Tier 2 locomotive, you're talking about the next tiers coming on board, looking forward here. We have, again, the preemption question, you need to, I think, take it down to the local level. The state of California is one, but I also see it happening in Texas and many communities. When you think about clean air and the requirements that will be placed in the railroad industry in terms of being part of the solution. We are targets. You think about California, there are 2 large railroads out there. We are in significant discussion in terms of the requirements going forward. There are proposals that every locomotive in the state of California must be Tier 2 compliant. In fact, we have an agreement over a certain timeline that is going to force us to accelerate our investment in locomotives.
You had a picture of the bridge over the Mississippi River that was seriously deteriorating and needs repair, et cetera. I recall back after 9/11, there was a real concern over how many bridges there actually are over the Mississippi River and how many railroad bridges there are and how critical they are to the national security and the national economic welfare. Has you ever given any thought to looking to DHS for support for getting capital investment in the railroad industry, because these, after all, are secure, are critical to the nation's infrastructure and the nation's security?
We have not. Now, what we have looked at is in terms of maybe support with some security. But I have to tell you, when you look at some of these bridges, while the bridge I cited was maybe $150 million, there are a few other bridges that the price tag could be $1 billion when you look at some of the high bridges over the railroad. I think the right approach in terms of that investment is ensure that we have the ability to increase our returns, and I believe the investment tax credit proposal is a way that can help deal with that issue in the future.
Matt, can you provide us with some examples of statutory, regulatory, or institutional barriers to rail capital expansion, and how can we overcome some of these barriers? You mentioned those in your.
Jim mentioned California. I mean, there was a great example of we've got a regional issue there in California that they're trying to establish different air quality standards outside of the federal standard. That's an issue. When we get out and we try and make a capacity expansions all across our railroad, my favorite one, we had one up in the state of Washington where we were putting a siding on the Columbia River Gorge. It was to put a 10,000-foot siding to allow trains to meet pass and plan. It took us about 2.5 years. We got drug into the Columbia River Gorge Association. We got drug into the core issues. We had lawsuits from a group of windsurfers that didn't want their parking lot moved 400 feet. And I just went by that on the railroad last week, and you have to sit there and just shake your head. You've got this Columbia River Gorge for 75 miles, and this 10,000-foot siding is in a part of the railroad that we're running 40 trains a day on, and quite frankly, that helps facilitate train movement in and out of the state. And yet, these aren't bad people. Everybody's just, not in my backyard for any more rail capacity. And if that's where the country's going, whether or not you have the property or not, you can still get shut down in terms of being able to make these. And when we don't have a strong federal preemption, we're going to get ourselves into a lot of trouble. We will sub-optimize where we've gotten all the benefits out of a federally preempted rail network.
Well, one last question. Can you provide any examples where either you or UP have had positive outcomes in addressing community concerns about a rail capacity expansion project, and what differentiated these situations from the examples where the outcomes have been less positive or more difficult to achieve? Is there a set of circumstances or situations where it's easier and more fruitful to work with the communities?
Yeah, I mean, the positive one I would tell you on our railroad is Joliet Logistics Park Joliet. This was a blighted area. This is an area that was environmentally damaged from having munitions on this at this depot, and they had high unemployment. We went in there and thoughtfully worked with the community, with the mayor, and got everybody on board and cleaned up the environment, and then talked about all the jobs and the commerce. And when we had the grand opening, there literally wasn't enough room on the dais for all the politicals and all the people that wanted to be a part of this big development. That is unusual today in wanting to build capacity. We've kind of lost that as a country, whether it's on the railroads or the highways or ports or anything else, and it is where urban sprawl is meeting commerce, and it's not a pretty scene.
Mr. Young?
Well, there are several examples. Our new Dallas Intermodal Facility is one that was a cooperative effort, worked together, and it covers a whole array of areas. I think many times people think of public-private partnerships as putting money in on both sides. One of the things that they helped us do there is the permitting process, expediting the process, making certain we're working together as a group to move forward and get projects done.
Thanks. I have a couple more questions. Bear with us. We appreciate your patience and your participation here today. Mr. Rose, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. You were talking about improved on-time performance and tracking some of your late trains. You mentioned progressing to 5 days late on average from a previous level of 20 days late. Can you extrapolate on that a little bit? Because to some, obviously, that's obviously improvement to anybody's ears, but 5 days late, if you're waiting for your shipment and you're a shipper, is still a problem. Is that something that's still prevalent, or are you talking about the rare exception when a train happens to be late?
That is in the grain industry specifically. I'm talking about grain cars being late, and I think it is generally accepted. It's not something that people say they're happy with, but on the other hand, I think it's to be within a 7-day period, people would generally believe, in the grain business again only, that is within an acceptable rate. When we were 20 days late, we had 22,000 past due orders. We were causing problems, and quite frankly, it was that we didn't have enough grain cars in. And at that time, grain, if you remember my chart, grain started really moving up in terms of movements. A lot of it was the export grains, as well as domestic feedlot movements, and there was just a lot more demand than we can handle. And so we've applied a lot of resources. We've added a lot of grain cars to bring that down, as well as the single biggest way that we've been able to improve our service and handle more grain is through the efficiency of the shuttle network. And so while I guess, Chairman, what I would say is, while we would hope we would never be a day late on a grain car order, I don't think that that's practical given the way that the grain harvest moves around and given the irregularities with the grain movements. And I believe that if you would ask, and you'll get a chance to later, and ask those representing the grain industry, how is service on DNSF, I think they will tell you that it's pretty good.
Just sticking to the grain industry for a minute, I've had a chance to spend a little bit of time up in Montana and have certainly visited with grain producers here in Washington extensively. Recently, a very articulate Montanan visited with me to talk about the situation facing the ag sector there in her state. And I will say she complimented your railroad and Mr. Kaufman's efforts recently for showing some real signs of investment and improved service. And towards the end of the meeting, I asked her, as I often do with visitors and stakeholders, what can we do at the board to help the situation? And she looked at me with all seriousness and said, can we get the railroad track back? Could it be given back to the state? I really hadn't had that request before, and I paused on that and asked her to explain a little bit. She said, well, we think if we just had it ourselves to manage, we could do a better job and reduce rates. And she was very sincere, and told her I didn't think I could help her on that right away. But I did tell her I would bring it up with you and just, is that something that you actually seriously hear about there? Because this was not just a random person on the street. This was, a leader and a spokesman. And I just wanted, what would happen? Let me just ask you, if you decided mutually, that it was mutually beneficial, you and the state of Montana, to just pull up and leave and turn over your operations to them? What would be your anticipated outcome?
Well, certainly we've seen this in other states where they've said, well, we'll take over the gathering and distribution. The state of South Dakota did it. The state of Kansas has applied monies to it. Other states have said, well, we'll provide grain cars. But when it really gets down to looking and a bill starts going through their public process, their legislator, and somebody says the state's going to buy 1,000 cars, well, why won't the market do it? Well, because these are surge cars, and they're only going to be used 4 months of the year. Well, so there's really no financial viability for these cars. So those things don't have long legs. We've seen the same thing in terms of where states say, well, if the Class 1 won't provide the service and the Class 2 ends up not being able to reinvest in the line, then we'll buy it. Great example is the state of Texas, where they bought some railroad, and they still to this day own it. It was owned by a Class 1 originally, and then it was sold to a Class 2, and then this Class 2 looked at it and said that the business model couldn't be substantiated, so they sold it to the state. The state of Texas owns this piece of railroad in the middle of the state, and there hasn't been a moved on it since the Class 2 quit operating on it. So, Chairman, I think that these are all interesting issues, but the litmus test usually comes back, I think, from a public policy. Is there a business model that will support that investment? If it is, then the state can clearly make a decision if they want to own it, and there's nothing that prevents them from operating certain rail assets. And as we go through our shortlining process, if the state of Montana or the state of North Dakota wants to buy these pieces of railroad to operate them, we'd be more than happy to sell it to them. Now, given that we have the mainmost line of our northern route of the railroad, we are not going to sell that because, again, it is our network that connects from the east and the west.
Thank you. And just to stick with you, Mr. Rose, certainly, and both of you touched on this, and as I expected you would and you should, that operations play a key, managing your operations play a key role in meeting capacity needs and demands. Situations such as cars laying idle on your track for periods of time obviously can obstruct the free flow and efficient flow of commerce. I have been visited recently, though, and heard from a number of shippers who are concerned with a policy that the BNSF is either soon to roll out or has recently announced, and it may be common in the industry, I don't know, focused on chemical and hazardous materials, tanker cars in particular, in an understandable effort, I believe, to reduce what I'll call the idle time that those cars might sit full of the hazardous materials on your mainline track, waiting for a shipper to open the gates, so to speak, and bring the car in and safeguard it. I can tell you that there's some real concern out there that with communication challenges and some of the late arrivals that do happen in the industry. I know it's probably not 5 days I hope not for hazardous materials, but that a shipper would just not know when the car is coming, and all of a sudden, middle of the night on a Saturday night or Sunday morning, there it appears, and all of a sudden a late fee gets slapped on the shipper. And are you working on communication and how this will all get implemented? Because I think I can completely understand what you're trying to achieve, and I think it could well be a win-win if it's properly implemented. But we're a little worried about how it gets implemented and the complaints we might get.
I need to take a minute here because this is a thoughtful question. For years now, since 9/11 and since we started to see Homeland Security come forth with new laws and regulatory issues around the transportation of hazardous material, we've probably had 5 horrific accidents in the rail industry in the last 10 years that have cost this industry close to $1 billion, and I would say have probably, without a doubt, wiped out all the profitability of this segment. We've been asking members of Congress, we've been asking customers to help support us in changing limits of liability, and quite frankly, even from the Chemical Association, we've gotten no receptivity to that. Just recently, they've come out and said that the current model is working very well. Well, the current model basically is that the rest of the shipping public is paying for the risk that we see in this very, very small percent of our shipments. And at BNSF, we're talking about 3 to 4/10%. 17,000 cars that we moved on our railroad last year is now impacting the other 99% in terms of our insurance costs. And so we are, through rates, putting people on notice to say, you know, when you order chlorine, we don't want it in our yard. We've got Homeland Security that's getting that is launching new regs that's going to call for the railroads to provide constant surveillance on these loads. We do not have the personnel to babysit the 17,000 cars on this railroad. And quite frankly, it's going to be a cost that the rest of the shipping community shouldn't have to pay for. So we are vitally concerned. We want to handle this stuff in the proper way. We've come forth with new tank car standards. That has been met with great reluctance and resistance. And so one of the ways that we will lower our risk is to make sure that a customer doesn't order a car, what we call a CP, where we constructively place it and the car gets shipped to a destination. Now, in answer to your specific question, Chairman, if we're providing bad service and we end up bunching cars in terms of their supply chain, and that's the sole reason why a car cannot be unloaded, then we will take care of that demurrage charge and work with that customer on that. But for customers who are routinely using the constructively placed process and putting loads of chlorine or ammonia outside of the gates, and that we're going to be subject to those regulations, we're going to, through market-based rates, incentivize them to build storage capacity on their own facility to get it off our railroad.
Thank you. Do you see a role for just what I'll call basic communication, whether it's an email from a BlackBerry or a cell phone call from a train saying, hey, in the next 24 hours, it's coming, and just because that's the concern I hear is that folks just doing their normal operations, and obviously, given what you described, perhaps normal operations need to be adjusted on all sides, but will just, in a well-intentioned way, not realize that something's been delivered in the middle of the night and get slapped with a fee.
Yeah, we have a full CRM, customer relationship management system, that allows, if a customer wants a page to their BlackBerry 24 hours out, 48 hours out, they can do that. And certainly, if any customer doesn't believe that they're getting proper notification, they should make contact through our marketing department, and we'll change that. But we have, I think you'd be amazed at the level of sophistication of the transmittal of car location movements in the rail industry today.
And lastly, on that, not to dwell, but if I could just get your commitment to have your team keep in touch with our staff just on how it's going, how the implementation's going, and what efforts you're undertaking to work with your customers to make it a smooth transition to what I think is a very important objective. And
we put out we were putting out, or we have last night, or it may, I assume it's out now, a full communication program on this. I'll make sure that your staff gets a copy of that.
Thanks. Vice Chairman Buttrey, additional questions?
On the issue of car tracking and so forth, just one question. Do you see GPS actually replacing RFID technology in terms of tracking cars and so forth, mainly because of the security issues?
I think long term it will, Vice Chairman. I think there'll be probably something in security around GPS on hazardous cars, and I think as GPS technology gets smarter in terms of understanding, heat ratios within cars, things like that, that will eventually go down that path. It'll be a while.
Thank you.
Mr. Mulvey?
Yeah, a couple of small questions. We got some information on capacity, velocity. I mean, one of the critical components of capacity is velocity. And in both the cases of the UP and the BN, velocity has declined considerably in the 21st century. For the BN, it's gone from an average of about 27 miles per hour to 23.4 miles per hour. That's from the first quarter of 2000 to now, first quarter of 2007. For the UP, it's gone from 26 miles an hour to 21.7 miles an hour. What specifically, more than anything else, can be done to improve the velocity? We know why, in part, it's the increased traffic, but there has been considerable investment at the same time. So what more than anything else can be done to improve the velocity of the trains?
Well, Commissioner Mulvey, again, when you look back at the initiatives and capital that we talked about, process innovation, looking at turning assets, SIMS, working with customers, again, you get back to the question on hazmat. UP handles 36,000 carloads of toxic inhalants a year. When you look at that supply chain and you look historically, it's inefficient. You had bunching in terminals, you had receivers that could not take on arrival. Those are velocity killers. They end up backing up in the supply chain, backing up in yards. When you had excess capacity, you might accept that. Today, it's unacceptable. It affects our service here. Point-to-point trains, capacity when you talk about both on track infrastructure and receiving facilities are important out here. Incentives for customers in terms of loading, unloading, all play a role in the process and velocity. I think you've seen our stats before. We take it very serious. 1 mile an hour is worth the equivalent of about 200 to 250 locomotives on our system, 10,000 freight cars. So it is a very serious goal for us, and I hope you have seen our velocity is moving up. I'll get you the charts if you haven't seen that.
Ours was just the volume surprise. I mean, in 2005, 10.3% volume, 2006, 6.7. I mean, it's just been phenomenal. It's a 3.5 million more units, and quite frankly, we didn't have the capital there soon enough. But 06 was better than 05, and I think generally across the board, our customers would tell you that they got a better ride in 06 and 05 because the capital started coming in.
There's been some suggestion positive train control would be a great help to capacity, to velocity rather, that allow the trains to run shorter headways, run faster, safer. In fact, one study I remember said that the railroads would not need to invest in signaling systems. The entire country would be no more dark territory, no more need for signals. The whole thing could be done through GPS and PTC. And one study estimated a payback period on this of about 18 months, which is pretty phenomenal. But I think that you're not quite as sanguine about the potential of that full-fledged PTC as that report was.
I think, Commissioner, if you just think about the evolution here, we've got to get to train control technology, which is kind of where we're now in with the experimental stage. The next one is moving block or a movement planner, and you're starting to see, you'll see and hear from railroads, they've got a movement planner operating platform, and they're starting to roll that out. I think NS is probably the furthest along with some of their work. And then the next one is a moving block system using GPS, and we can kind of forget about PTC, PTS, ETMS, all that nomenclature. What we're really long-term, the view is if we can get to a moving block system without the signal system, which is we'll take away that headwind, it's really more beneficial from a capacity standpoint, from a velocity standpoint. You'll get some benefits from a velocity, but if you think about what a moving block system will do, on our network, we think that it's worth somewhere between a 15 to 25% one-time capital improvement in terms of expansion capacity. It's right now dreadfully expensive, as with all this technology, and as we experiment and work through it, we believe that the cost of technology will come down, but the rate of returns that you mentioned of 18%, we don't see anything close to that, and I would only reverse it to me to say if we did, we would have already done the investment.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good assessment from Matt's point. It is, we've got 2 pilots today. We're running one North Platte up into the coal mines and also from Hinkle up to Eastport with the CP. The costs are substantial. We see fuel efficiency also as a potential, and their safety obviously is there. We've got a long-term investment here, and again, you think about the capital needs. You're doing a risk assessment for our railroad. It's probably anywhere from just get the basic system in $600 to $800 million investment.
Well, one last question. As you know, the board is looking at its calculation of the cost of capital, how we calculate the cost of both debt and equity capital. You mentioned the growing importance of replacement costs, especially in a capacity-constrained environment. The board still uses historic costs. Do you think the board ought to begin to move towards replacement costs in calculating the cost of capital?
You know, there's no question in my mind that you need to take that into consideration. And at the end of the day, you have to look externally. The credit agencies, the equity analysts, the way they look at returns in our business, they're much more cash flow generated types of returns when they're bringing in the current cost of your capital programs. And it is an issue. The examples I put on the screen today in terms of the huge spread, at UP today, our capital investment is 2.5 times book depreciation. You think about that a minute. There's no other industry that's even close, and I would really encourage you to consider replacement cost in that calculation.
Matt?
I would not ever contradict a former CFO.
again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Young. Just a couple of quick questions. I want to discuss with you a little bit embargoes, and I hear a lot about them from visitors and your customers. I'd like to get you to educate me a little bit on when embargoes are appropriate. Obviously, we can all agree easily that after avalanches or hurricanes, when track is put out of order and service and there are safety problems, absolutely you've got to do what it takes to take the time necessary to bring those tracks into a safe operating condition. But the message that sometimes gets conveyed to shippers is that you're busy, and you're so busy that you need to embargo some customers for a while until you can get a little less busy, and that gets passed along second, third hand sometimes in different ways that don't sound like traditional embargoes. And just it's not a UP challenge alone. I'll just go through the data that we have here from our staff. In 2006, the UP issued 54 embargoes of various types. Some lasted only a few days, while the others lasted for a year or more. In fact, I was reading in the trade press recently, you've just lifted one that was in effect probably your longest one, I would guess, the 2-year one out in the Powder River Basin. CSX, 4 embargoes. And I will say that so far this year, 2007, UP has issued 20 embargoes. CSX issued 4 embargoes in 2006 and 2 so far this year. NS 2 in 06, 3 so far this year. BNSF 22 embargoes in 2006 and 12 so far this year. KCS 2 and 4 this year. CP 11 and 9 this year. CN 5 and 6. Talk to me about this. You must hear about these concerns from your customers often. I know I do. I've met with some shippers who have taken the time and effort and investment and money to locate where they have access to Class 1s. And then because of an embargo, they're back to having access to one after enormous investments, and they feel their whole business model gets thrown on its face. But what can you tell me about your decision-making and your thoughts in imposing an embargo?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I approve every embargo that's issued, so we take it very serious. We understand the consequence. It really is a function of being overwhelmed to a great extent with the very strong growth in volume and not enough capacity. The more obvious and the largest embargo we had was moving coal to the east. That's off. We no longer have embargoes in terms of our coal business out here. I see them being a much less significant issue going forward here. But you still have to manage the network. In some cases, we'll have them for floods. I wish I could tell you that we can predict weather, but I'll bet I'm going to have a few washouts here sometime here this spring. Additionally, where we have targeted some embargoes are in places where, because of issues either with customer capability at a plant, the ability to efficiently load, unload, we see equipment backing up in the network. Now, in days when you had excess capacity, holding 20 cars in a yard 10 miles out was okay. Today, when the capacity is tight, it starts to affect and impact the whole network and all customers. Again, as we continue to put capacity in our network here, I see them being a much less issue going forward.
Vice Chairman Buttrey, questions?
Just a follow-up to your question. The shipper that's embargoed, I presume, is moving the freight some other way. Trucks, presumably?
Some cases they're not. I mean, in some cases, what you may have an issue with the plant that's down, where it's a 24-hour embargo or a 48-hour embargo. Again, the resiliency in the rail network today, we have much less room for error. Your ability to absorb surges in capacity, you have to be very proactive. Unfortunately, what happens if you wait too long managing that network, you create a problem that's much greater and much tougher to solve over the long term. Many of these embargoes, again, are 24-hour, 48-hour types of embargoes. We work with the customer if we can do transload, and we try to be proactive in terms of looking at their supply chain coming forward. When they get the facility reopened, in a lot of cases, we'll put extra people on to switch the plant and get them healthy.
Just curious, from an issue of captivity, I was asking about that, whether a customer is actually captive or not.
You know, Mr. Vice Chairman, I want to handle more business and more volume. What we have to do is make certain, again, that we've got an efficient network. We have to have discipline in the whole supply chain. Now, the question is, if we don't manage both the point of origin and the point of destination, then the railroads need to build surge capacity for those issues. Plant shut down, surge in business, that's a cost. And someplace in the chain, as I said earlier, if our only solution in our business is to put dollars in the ground, we're out of business. We've got to get very disciplined. And the railroads have a commitment here. Reliable service so the customer can understand what's coming at them, but the whole chain needs to be much more efficient going forward. And unfortunately, embargoes, again, they were very limited occurrences, are one of the ways that we are managing that supply chain.
Commissioner Mulvey, any questions? That concludes our questions for this panel. We appreciate your patience and bearing with us, and we very much appreciate your participation today. And we'll dismiss you now. And next, I'd like to call up our next panel, Mr. Michael Ward, Mr. Michael Haverty, and Mr. Charles Mormon.
Morning. Did you want to sit here? No. No, I got somebody clicking for me. Did you want to switch?
Any other speakers who hadn't checked in, please come forward now.
In the interest of keeping us going here, Chairman had to exit for a moment, but we'll proceed. Is there some order that you've agreed to about how you're going to speak?
Well, I think my slides are queued up first, so that's probably what we're going to do first.
Okay. Mr. Haverty, you're next, right? Okay. Mr. Mormon, you're going to bring up the rear.
Yeah, I guess.
Mr. Ward, you may proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Vice Chairman, Mr. Commissioner. Appreciate the opportunity.
I'll be right back.
Yes. I'm Michael Ward with CSX. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and testify at this hearing, and I compliment you on highlighting the issues around rail capacity and freight infrastructure demands as we go forward. It's interesting, the challenges we face in the rail industry are much different than I've ever seen in my 30 years in the business. We've really seen demand for transportation at unprecedented levels, and we expect that demand to do nothing but grow as we go forward. And as we look at our business, we think our biggest strategic challenge is how do we position our company to be ready to meet that demand, and how do we make sure we're making those investments in the right place. Excuse me. Every day, our 34,000 employees, they are striving to meet the needs of our freight customers across our 21,000 miles of railroad in 23 states and the District of Columbia. And our railroad operates in some of the most dense and fastest growing parts of the country. We serve 2/3 of the U.S. population and more than 70 ports. And although CSX and its predecessor railroads have been operating for more than 100 years, today we're really a company in transition, and our goal of achieving continuous, consistent improvement applies to safety, to service, and to our productivity. In 2006, we reduced train accidents and employee injuries by more than 20%, and our goals for 2007 are just as ambitious. And we're going to reach those goals by training our employees at our new Railroad Education and Development Center in Atlanta, following our track maintenance plan to install more than 3 million new cross ties and more than 400 miles of new track, and adhering to our safety rules and operating practices. There's no question in my mind that safety is one of the top priorities at CSX, and I know that belief is held by the hardworking men and women across our network. These safety improvements we've seen, as well as gains in other operating measures, our on-time originations improved 56% last year through our increases in velocity and our reduced dwell time,